All right. So in this first video demo for Blender, guys, we're going to be looking at working in the interface. So we need to get a few things together for getting our project prepared. First things first, make sure that you have launched Blender from the application bar down at the bottom of your screen. Blender looks like this kind of crazy twirly orange icon. If you're looking at a projection screen of this, you probably can't see it, but it's right next to the big red FL icon if you're in the lab. So you can find the Blender icon down there at the bottom. You can also use Spotlight Search up at the top to locate it. All right, so once you've got that initiated, a couple other things that we need to do. We need to go ahead and pull just for demonstration purposes and for practice, some of the demo files and things to work on this project. Again, you're welcome to import your own personal bust scan that you got from the Fab Lab for this process. I will be using the demonstration models off of Blackboard. So I'm going to go to my Blackboard page, and you should go into the first software exercise for Blender. So if you navigate through Project 3, you'll find the first one, which is folder number 5, working with the interface. And when you go in there, if you scroll down to where it says materials, you'll have 2 items that you can download from here. One that's called the Cyclorama model, and another one called the demonstration scan. The Cyclorama model is something that you'll get to use in your own project. As a staging space to place your model design on. The demonstration scan is just as it says. It's for in-class demos only, so you should not be utilizing that model in your design. Instead, you should be using your own 3D scan for that. Okay. I'm just going to maximize some of my screen here. All right. So one of the other things that we want to establish, and that I always establish with a project, is make sure that you have a project folder structure in hand and ready to go when you start this assignment. So one of the ways that you can rig that up and have that ready, again, is just having like the basic structure system that we've used to this point. And I'm just going to create a couple new folders out here to give you an idea of what that could look like. So this is going to be project 3. And inside this folder, again, we'll have some basic folders in here as well. One of them that's special to this project is going to be for textures. So I'm just going to quickly create a folder inside that says textures. I'll go ahead and make a new folder for in progress, so that's where I might keep my, if I can spell it right, that's where I'm going to keep my Blender file while I'm working on it throughout the course. And for any 3D models that you bring in, right, like your 3D scan or the Cyclorama model, you probably will want like a folder for that set aside. Just to keep handy so you can keep those stored in one place. The good news is when you import a model into Blender or into a 3D modeling software is that it becomes a part of the actual Blender file in this case. So you don't have to keep re-importing it to make it work every time. But this will just keep the original somewhere safe. And then of course a file folder for output would be appropriate. And those are pretty much the basics. All right. Make sure we got that rigged. Now I'm going to go ahead and grab my downloaded images. So I'm going to go find where I've saved those onto the computer. And again, they download as zip folders, so make sure that you unzip each folder by double-clicking on it to open up the contents from inside for each of your models. If if you're using the demo scan. If you have your own model present with you today, then of course, while you're working in this exercise, you can just open whatever you have. That should be either an OBJ or an STL file that you would have received from your actual scan at the Fab Lab. But here are mine, the cyclorama and the demo scan, which is me. So I'm just going to grab both of those files, and I'm going to drag them into my models folder over here, so that I got a place to keep them safe. All right. Now that we got that all ready, let's go ahead and hop back into Blender. All right. So in Blender, what you can do when you initiate the software, you might get like a little cartoony looking splash screen that pops up. You can click outside of that to make it just disappear. And it'll kind of reveal for you the basic Blender screen, which probably looks something like mine. And what you see are a few things going on here that we're going to get into. The basic outline of three-dimensional software is mostly based on panel systems and maybe some toolbars. But in Blender, it's primarily designed around different panels and different panel windows is the way they have it designed. So the basic format that you see when you open it initially is what I want to explain to you today. Because this whole system can be completely changed in a matter of clicks. So let me give you a little walkthrough. Let's start over on the left side of the screen. So on the left, we have a long-running selection of panels over here. The first group being this little grouping of tabs, little vertical selection of tabs that run over here. These are tabs specific to what's called object editing mode or basic object mode. This is a standard mode in Blender where you are able to like move objects around, combine them together, add more objects into the scene, and do things of that sort. So the first tab we have open is something called Tool. Over here on the left, under Tool you have a couple basic functions. The first group is under Transform. These are your functions for moving objects around, scaling them, rotating them, and flipping them inside the environment. So if you click on one right now, like let's do Translate. Click on the word Translate and move your mouse. And after you click on Translate, what it does is that it automatically locks your mouse onto the object so that as you move your mouse around, the object moves inside of 3D space. Translate, they also use interchangeably in here with the word move or grab is also another name for this function. But again, it's the ability to move an object in space. And it'll do it just in a basic side to side or up and down feature based on the window or viewing angle that you're at. We'll look at ways to manipulate it beyond that in a minute. But if you click one more time in the environment, it will release your mouse from the Translate tool, and then you'll be able to do something different. So go ahead and just click your mouse to disengage the tool. And you can also do this with Rotate, so the same thing happens. Click on Rotate, and now move your mouse. And when you click on Rotate, it will allow you to spin the object in on one axis based on the viewing angle that you're at. And then if you do Scale, same thing applies. You can actually keep moving and scrolling your mouse past the screen restrictions, and it will keep letting you scale it up or down. You can scale at an angle to the object, or I think, yeah, opposite diagonals to make it go in and out of its original shape to scale it up and down. But again, you can click the mouse anytime to disengage this tool. Now those are your basic transform keys that are found over here in Tools. Other functions you'll find, like under Edit, that's listed below Transform, are things like Duplicate. So with any object that you have selected, you can actually quickly duplicate it by just using this button on the side screen. If you hover your mouse over any button, usually it'll tell you what the button does or it'll also list a shortcut next to that button. So here, if I hit duplicate, I can pull out a copy. I can also do it again, and I can play around with it as I go. But that's just showing you how duplicate can work. There's other functions in here that we'll look at in a minute, like how to adjust shading of objects. So organic forms, you can have them shade flat to look geometric. Or you can also change it to where the shading is applied smoothly across the entire surface. It won't make sense with a cube to make it smooth shaded, but it would with something like a circle, or a sphere, or some other organic form like your statue. There's a button here that you'll probably see that says Set Origin. Set Origin is actually a tool for moving objects across the scene automatically, repositioning them. We'll use this for repositioning your 3D scan inside of Blender, again, which we'll come to in a little bit. You may notice down below Edit that there's actually, if you scroll down on this menu, there's actually a button down arrow for History. So you can also access levels of history in here like we could with Photoshop that are stored inside of Blender as you go. So you can use history to make adjustments to those if you need to. Command Z still works, by the way, if you need to undo one step backwards, just so you're aware of that. So that's the basic toolbar. Now these bars over here, these tabs change every time we switch object modes later, and again, that'll be something we'll tackle once we get to it. But just to be aware that these will not stay the same when you switch different modes inside of Blender. Okay, now the next tab down says Create. Create's kind of fun because this has lots of standard shapes, lighting systems, and other odds and ends objects that you can automatically add to your scene. So go ahead and try to add like some extra objects from the Create tab over on the left. So I'm going to add a UV sphere, maybe a cone, a monkey named Suzanne. Yeah, if you look on there, there's one here that says monkey. This is Blender's sort of mascot. Now what's interesting you should notice is that every time you add an object, it appears right around the center of this sort of grid plane in your viewport editing area. Your viewport area inside of Blender is called the scene. So that's your editing environment. And the grid, you should think of it as like a floor, sort of represents like a floor space for you to set objects across, to measure them up against. It also represents the center of 3D space inside your design area, which is important. Without that, you have no grid for where objects appear inside the scene. 3D space, again, is infinite, so there are no edges to it or ending points to it. It just keeps going. But again, once you've added objects to your scene, then you can always go back to those transform tools and you can move things around and play with them. Kind of fun. Yeah?
How do we move the view of the plane? How do we move like the view of the plane?
We'll talk about that in a minute, yeah. All right. So that kind of gives you an idea of what you can add from the Create menu. Again, there are other odds and ends objects that we can add. We're not going to really cover all of them today, except that you can add base shapes to your design. These are kinds of things that you can use to build other forms from. So using them as like starter shapes, essentially, to sculpt new things out of. All right. I'm not really going to cover all of the little tabs over here on the left. Those are the two that I want you to know about primarily for tools and creating. If you switch sides of the screen real quick, go over to the right, and I want you to look at the right side here, and I want to identify some of these specific panels that are listed on the right side, starting with the one on the top. This first panel on the top right, this is what's called the outliner panel. And the outliner which what you can kind of see here is like this little stacked sort of view of all the things that are actually presented in your scene currently. So orange objects tend to represent actual forms out inside your scene, like the monkey or a ball or a camera or even a light source. Those are all listed in orange. But this is basically what's called a hierarchy structure for modeling. It's very normal for 3D modeling software to be listed this way. You can almost think of it as like the layers menu in Photoshop. The cool thing in here is we can also make adjustments inside this outliner view, like to change names of a layer. You can just double click on it to rename it. So for cone, I could call it something else. Or cubes. See how I've got like 3 different cubes in my scene right now? I could rename each one. And they're all represented here. You should also notice that each one of these objects listed has like a way to expand them down using the little plus sign next to the little tree next to it. And so you can keep expanding these layers down to see what they're made of. Whether or not they have a mesh matrix, which is what that triangular form is, that icon, or if they have a material associated with them, or even a texture, which is the TEX with the red and white checkerboard. You can find all of that inside of the outliner menu just by expanding down the model options. Other important things to notice about this menu. Over on the far right of each of your model objects listed in the outliner, you've got an eyeball, a mouse arrow, and you also have a little camera icon. Each one of these does something different for that particular shape on your screen. So if I go down to the one that's called Suzanne, this layer, that's the monkey for mine. If I select it by clicking on it, it'll highlight inside my main scene area. So this is also a way that you can select objects in your scene by just clicking on it in the outliner menu. But each of those little icons to the far right of each of your objects controls it. So the eyeball turns off temporarily the visibility of that object. It does not remove it from the scene. Let's keep that in mind. It just turns it off while you're editing. The next icon, the white arrow, that's actually transformation control lock. So if you turn off the white arrow for a given object, that object cannot be manipulated. You can't check it, you can't move it, you can't accidentally delete it by turning off the little white arrow for a layer. So that's just important to know. So in case you position something in space correctly and you don't want to touch it again by accident or delete it, just turn off the white arrow icon and that will lock it into place for the duration of your editing. The last icon is the camera, and that's actually for something called rendering. So when you're done with your final design and you output 2D like JPEG stills that are complete renderings of your scene, you can turn off the icon for the camera next to that object and it will keep it from being added to the final flat render of your scene, which we'll talk about more later down the line. But that's what those 3 little icons do to help navigate and manage your design environment inside of Blender. Okay, so that's the outliner panel. Again, that's basically just showing you the structure of everything that's inside of your design, whether or not you have lights, a camera source, or whatever objects you have in your scene. And again, when you're adding things, always rename them so you know what they are in your scene where possible. Don't just leave it as like cube number 1000, okay? If you can help it. Okay, so that's the first panel that's important that you'll use a lot of. The next one down is this panel called Properties. Properties is this next group that has this strip of icons listed on top of it. And the Properties panel basically gives you access to whatever object you have selected on screen or thing. It will list all of the available properties that you can change about that, individual object. So if I select my sphere that's out here on my screen, this sphere if I have it highlighted, it can give me information about that layer. So let me switch on these icons that are inside the property panel. I'm going to click on the one that looks like an orange cube. So find that little icon on Properties panel and click on the orange cube. And by the way, you can resize panels by moving your mouse along the border line of a panel to convert your arrow into a double arrow. And then you can stretch it out to see more of the details of the panel more clearly. That's why I pulled mine out like this. So I just move my mouse to the edge and drag. But what I get whenever I click on the orange cube icon is it gives me properties for this object, like its location is listed under this little transform area precisely in 3D space. It also lists rotation values, if it's been rotated, and if the scale has changed from its original state in the design. Again, if I go to my tool tab over on the left and I change something like scale now, now my values for that shape also change as I change that object size. So scale is changing as I scale it up. Rotation changes as I rotate. And translate changes the location. And we see all of that actively changing in the transform panel. What's also good is that it tracks that information, but you can also click and drag on the values inside of the transform area for properties to change those values a little bit more finitely, so you can watch the number change as you move the object. And that's just by clicking on dragging on the value. So I can get strange scaling changes if I need to that are controlled by the axis that I scale on. Notice that each of these transform options are listed in XYZ numerical formats. If you remember from our lecture the other day, XYZ helps us understand three-dimensional space, so we can slide X and Y as left and right, and then depth is Z, which is up and down inside of Blender to give an object volume. If you have, just to give you an illustration of that, if you have an object in your scene, go ahead and select it. And you should notice pop up on that object you have selected, 3 little arrows pop out of that object on screen, and they're colored. One's green, one's red, and one's blue. They're pretty basic. The green arrow represents the y-axis. By the way, you can actually click and drag on these arrows when you see them inside of your Blender screen on your object. So I can literally click on the blue or the green or the red arrow for this object and drag the object along that axis. Just as kind of an they would call that like an on-screen widget. But again, movement and positioning of objects in 3D space is based on a 3-axis system, X, Y, and Z. Okay. So that's just basics of understanding what you could use property for. There's a lot of other stuff in here I'm not really going to get into today. Some of the other cool things you can access from the properties menu. They have a place in here. There's a blue wrench icon that we'll talk about in the next software exercise for tools and operations. But this little blue wrench under properties is for adding modifiers to a model. So under here, you can actually go in and add special transformations to a model design. You also have options in this menu for setting materials. That's actually adding like color, texture to an object. So if you click on the orange sphere looking icon, that's your material icon. So you can actually add color to an existing object on screen to give it a surface. And it's usually blank when you go to material until you hit new. And then it'll automatically assign a blank white color to any selected model that you're currently working on. You may also notice next to that material sphere icon is another icon that's a red and white checkerboard. That's your texture icon where you can apply textures to your selected model. Now, we're not going to work with that today. Again, that's for a later exercise, but just so you know, it's there. There's also a button in here that looks like a little camera like we saw in the outliner panel. This is your rendering preview panel, and so you can actually preview render your scene that you're working on to see what it looks like by using that panel, by hitting like the render button. And so what it'll try to do is actually render a still point of view from your camera in your scene. So whatever your camera sees is what render will actually activate. Now, if you hit render, you will need to do something to go back to 3D view. And this is just good to know on the front end. When you do that, go down below your viewport to this little mini menu that shows up under your image. And there's an icon over on the far left that looks like a sunset image. If you click on that, you can go to all the other menus and use the one that says 3D view at the bottom. And that will switch you back into your object editor. And that's a good one to take note of. The cool thing in Blender is that you can actually change any one of these panels into another one of those 3D view panels or any of these listed here. Anytime that you see a little corner icon for a respective panel. So even with Outliner, I can click on the Outliner icon and I can switch it to another panel viewer if I need to. And that's a way that they allow you to kind of customize the Blender interface as you go. All right. All right, so that just kind of gives you a quick idea of that one side of the screen for the for the right side panels. Now, the last area that I want to show you, though, is the menu bar that runs across the bottom of your 3D menu. And that has a selection of file drop-downs and menus and icons. And there's a number of these that I want to briefly touch base on because some of these you will be able to use that will help you while you're first designing with your work. So first off, just to understand, all of these items down at the bottom are related to your active viewing panel that you have open. So right now, if I click on the corner icon here, it tells me this is for the 3D view, the little gray cube icon. So here are some things you can adjust on this panel that are important at this stage in the game. Number one, if you navigate over, you'll see that you have something that says Object Mode down below. Go ahead and click on that down there on the lower menu. And where it says Object Mode, these are all of the different editing modes that Blender offers based on the object you have selected on screen. So if you have an editable polygon object, you can actually switch from Object Mode, which is what you're in right now. You can go into something called Edit Mode, which allows you to do fine-tune editing to the surface of a model. Again, that's something we'll talk about next time specifically. There's also Sculpt Mode. This is a little bit more fun and free form. So Sculpt Mode actually allows you to use special painting and carving tools on a model to scrape and cut and add to it. A lot of people use this for character modeling and those kinds of things. And I'm not really going to touch base on the other editors. Those are kind of the three basics that you'll want to hang out in while we're working on this project, though. So I'm going to switch it back to Object Mode. The next icon next to Object, there's a white sphere. Everybody see the little white sphere? Go ahead and click on that. And I want to talk about each of these little modes that are listed. These are your viewport shaders under the white sphere. And viewport shaders actually allow you to change the way that you preview your editing mode. So right now it's on the basic solid viewer, so that's why we see solid shapes on screen that have a kind of a skinned color over them. We also have one called wireframe. If you switch to wireframe, this sort of shows you the base shape matrix that makes up your object on screen. If you go back in there, you also have one called texture, which does a preview of your screen based on wherever your lights are located. So my screen's kind of black because my light source is back here in the background. So I'm just going to move objects around so that you can sort of see what they look like when they're preview lit. And in case you're wondering what your light source is in your scene, it's this funky little dot that has a black dot that has a little vertical line extending down from it. That represents your light source that you can move around in your scene. But that's what texture preview allows you to do. So it's supposed to be able to allow you, if you have a texture applied to an object, it'll show it in this preview mode. Material gives you kind of a more solid color preview with lighting and shadow previews as well. And then rendered gives you what your standard actual still image preview is going to look like when you create it out of Blender. You can actually edit in this mode, but it's really jerky and not very efficient, in my opinion. Especially if you're on a computer that's not very, doesn't have a good RAM or graphics preview system on it. I don't recommend editing inside of render mode. Always edit either in solid, generally speaking. You can also use wireframe, but solid is a better preview so that you can see what your objects look like as you go. All right, so that's the sphere icon. Okay, so that's your viewport shaders. Let me see. Okay, let's slide over a few icons, and I want you to move to the one that looks like a little red, green, and blue little funky icon, little red, green, and blue lines that intersect each other. This is your axis icon. And if you click on that icon, the little red, green, blue one that looks like three little lines, this actually allows you to control whether or not that 3D axis widget pops up over an object you have selected on screen. So it can make it visible or invisible. I prefer to leave it on personally because it's easier to have it on so that I can grab and manipulate an object very carefully by clicking directly on the widget arrows that hover over a shape on screen. Other things that you'll find listed next to that icon, there are three more that are blue. The three little blue ones all have to do with controlling the shape or movement of your object. These are your transforms. So the first little blue one is an arrow. Arrow is just move. So if you click inside the little white circle that appears over a selected object on screen, you can actually just click and drag on the object and it will move it around. Likewise, that's move. If we move to the next little blue icon, this manipulator is for rotation. So it looks like a little blue arc. When you turn on the blue arc, it'll pop up a transform tool that simulates these sort of axis rotation controls for that object. So I can actually click and drag on the lines that appear or are superimposed over my object to rotate it along those axes. And if you click on the center white circle that's in the middle, you can actually click and drag and that'll free rotate your object. All right, so that's the little blue arc icon. The last one that looks like a line that connects to a square, that's scale. So when you turn on scale, that changes your 3D widget into not arrows anymore, but little squares at each end. And so what this allows you to do is actually change your scale for your object on screen based on those individual axes. So if you grab just one of those little boxes and stretch it, it will stretch the object only in that direction. But if you click on the little white circle in the center, it brings them all together and scales it up evenly as you click and drag on the little circle inside the object. This can give you more control instead of using the transform buttons over in the toolbar menu on the left, because those are kind of freeform. These just allow you to click directly on the object to manipulate it as you go, which gives you more control. All right. Now those are your basic transform tools that you can access from the lower part of the screen. And they're all tied to your little visible widget that pops up on whatever object you currently have selected. Other weird things you need to be aware of on the bottom, so you're not clicking on everything in sight, because you can kind of wreck your experience if you're not careful. The first one, you see this little group of grids down here on this menu bar? Like there's two little groupings of grids. These are considered layers actually inside of Blender. If you accidentally click on one of these other little grid squares down at the bottom, your whole scene will disappear temporarily. But if you look on there, there's one square that has like a little orange circle on it. And if you click back on that circle, that'll bring your scene back up because that's the layer you've been designing in. The reason they have this in here is that sometimes designers like to keep design elements completely separated from each other so that lighting and shadow don't affect other objects from other layers if they're all turned on. So it's a way of keeping things separated if necessary. All right. Okay, so that I just wanted to give you a little run through of what those items are across the bottom. If you click on the menu item back over towards the left where it says Object along this menu bar, Object actually gives you access to other little manipulation tools that you can use related to the shape on screen. So we can hide the object here with Show Hide. You can actually select various objects and group them together in this menu if you want to. You can also duplicate. You can delete from this menu. If you've wanted to know how to delete in Blender, you can't just hit the delete key, in case you've wondered. You have to use X on the keyboard to delete objects. So if I come out here and I select one of my objects, I can hit X on the keyboard to get rid of it. All right, so that's some things you can find under the object mode menu. Of course, you can also find history listed there. Your transform controls are also listed under this, and there's even more of them that you can adjust from that panel. You also have an add menu down at the bottom. So like we had the create tool tab over on the left, add also does the same thing, but you get more objects that you get access to. So you get some of the funky objects that are more organic, like metaballs, which actually kind of are organic, and they'll kind of mold and manipulate to each other, kind of like liquid. You've got special surfaces, curves that work like vectors, and then you have a host or a library of different mesh objects that you can add to your scene. All right. A couple things that we're going to do with the rest of this file as we work. We're going to go ahead and clean it up a little bit and delete all these excess objects out of the scene, unless you've already brought in your 3D scan, of course. But I'm going to prep my scene for importing my model and setting up my first Blender scene in here. So now we've kind of got a little bit of a run through the interface, so we're going to rig the rest of the scene. So I'm going to clean it up and get rid of these others. So I'm just going to go through either my outliner panel and select only shapes or meshes that are listed and delete them one by one with the X key. So I'll just select, delete, select, delete. And Blender always wants you to confirm you're deleting. That's why it pops up a secondary menu each time you select an object and hit X on the keyboard. All right. Now we're going to go ahead and import a couple items into our scene. So I'm going to go to File, and I'm going to slide down to Import, and this is where we're going to bring in our objects. Now notice on Import that you have to import based on the file format that you want to bring in. It's very specific in 3D software. You can't just open a random object. You have to import it. So our cyclorama image or shape is actually a collada file. So I'm going to start by importing that object into my scene. So when you go to that, it's going to open a special file browser like this. And what you want to do is navigate to where your file is located. If you just downloaded it, it's probably going to be listed under downloads. So you can go there to find it. It may be on the desktop if you've moved things into folders like I did. So I'm going to find my cyclorama model and select it, and then I'm going to go up here to the top where it says Import Collada on the right. And it will add it to my scene. Now, if you want to play around with your scene, like how to change angles on the scene, move it around, look around it, here are some shortcuts and things to know. The mouse doesn't work very effectively for this part, so it uses a lot of the number pad to control this. So if you look over on your number pad, over on your extended keyboard on the far right, you can use keys like 4, 8, 6, and 2 to orbit around your grid on screen by just clicking and to click to move. You can also use the plus and minus key to zoom in and out incrementally on your scene. I think you can also use your mouse wheel to scroll in and out if it's working. So if you have like a 3-button mouse with a scroll wheel, that's pretty handy, by the way. 3D software works really well with like a 3-button mouse. So if you have one you want to bring or use, be my guest. But again, we can use the numbers 4, 8, 6, or 2 to manipulate or orbit our viewport around. And we can use plus and minus to zoom in and out. That way we can kind of get a better angle on what our scene looks like, and you can also see what the cyclorama model looks like in our scene. So this is just a basic staging tool for propping or staging a scene on. Excuse me. Okay. Now that we've got that imported into our scene, what I'm going to do is go ahead and import now my 3D scan. So I'm going to go back to File, and I'm going to go back to Import. And this time, again, use the model format that's the same as your 3D scan. So if you need to go look inside your Finder panel to figure out what that is, you're welcome to go to that at this time. My model is an OBJ format, wavefront, so that's what I'll be importing for mine. And again, mine was placed inside of my model folder for my project, so it's very easy to get to. And then I'm going to click on the Import OBJ button up in the upper right. And after you do this, it might take a second to open it, but I want you to do something before you go clicking around being crazy. When you import a 3D scan, the model, technically speaking, is actually not located in the right place in 3D space. We actually have to reposition it and scale it down. It's actually pretty mammoth right now, and you probably can't even see it. So what I want you to do is in your outliner panel, make sure that your 3D model is selected. I don't know what it's going to be called for yours, but it's probably going to be something crazy like polygonal model or whatever. But make sure that you recognize it in your outliner panel, okay? Select it by clicking on it, so it should highlight white. And then what I want you to do, after you do that, go over to your Tool tab on the left side of the screen. And if you see the drop-down that says Set Origin, click on that. And I want you to click on the option that says Geometry to Origin. Now when you click on that, depending on where your zoom level is on your model may appear, you may appear to have seen your model from the inside, and so it looks kind of weird. If you see it from the outside, good for you. That means you're probably zoomed way away from your grid plane, and you may be too far away, actually. But what we're going to do is we're going to scale the model down to fit inside of our work environment. So what I'm going to do that is I'm going to use a shortcut for scale. So you may want to write down some of these keys just in case so you can use them anytime. Yeah.
I can't find set origin.
Did you click on the tab that says Tool over on the left?
Yes.
Okay, make sure your model is actually selected over in the outliner panel. It should be white. It should have white text highlight. Got it? Yeah. Okay.
And then set origin geometry.
Yeah, set origin and change it to geometry to origin. All right. Now, here are some shortcuts to know, to have handy when you're working inside of Blender. Again, these are super helpful. They're transform shortcuts. So to scale an item, you can click the S key at any time, and it will use the relative position of your mouse based on where the widget is on screen to allow you to drag towards or away from the widget to set the scale. So for my model, I'm going to do that. Watch how I do it. And you can kind of do it on your own afterwards. But see how my widget appears in the center of screen for my selected model? And it's huge. I'm going to have my mouse set far away from this because Blender will use the position of your mouse to track where you start changing transformations from. So I'm going to have it way out here. And I'm going to hit S on the keyboard once. And notice how it connects a line to my mouse on screen. And now if I drag my mouse in slowly towards where that dotted line is coming from, my model will start to rescale. Now it gets jittery. If your mouse approaches the center of where your widget is, it starts to freak out. So at some point, you can scale it down as much as you can and then click and then do the same operation one more time. Move your mouse away, hit S to scale it again, and then click your mouse to release it. Other shortcuts besides scale that you should know. G is grab. That allows you to move an object. So if you hit G, it'll allow you to move the object around based on the viewport angle that you're sitting at. So what you want to make sure of is that right now what we're going to do in just a second is we're going to change some viewing modes in Blender so we can get this thing positioned well. But that's G. That allows you to grab it. S is for scale. And then, as you might guess, R is for rotate. And R is kind of cool. If you click R twice on the keyboard, it'll switch your rotate from rotating based on the angle of your axis on screen to free rotate. And that shows like red and green arrows. And so then you can kind of spin your object however you want to. But that's when you hit R twice. When you're done with that, you can just hit escape and it'll cancel the tool. Or you can just click with your mouse to disengage, rotate. All right. Now, here's a cool feature that you need to know about working inside of Blender with positioning and moving objects around. This is called the quad view option. You can access this from the view menu down at the bottom of your 3D menu panel. So if you go down there to where it says view on your 3D menu, make sure you don't go to view on the very bottom menu at the bottom of Blender. That's your animation panel. That's a little confusing that that's open because we're not using it, but the one you want is this on your 3D menu. So go to view and slide all the way up on this little view menu until you get to the option at the top, near the top, that says toggle quad view. Again, don't go to the animation menu at the bottom of your Blender screen. Yeah. But go to toggle quad. Again, there's a shortcut in Blender to do it. You can use Control Alt Q will pop up the quad view and break your screen into 4 separate sections. And what this allows us to do is actually do accurate positioning of models in our scene, or accurate editing, I should say. So each of these viewports, as you notice, like they have a name in the upper left corner for each one. So the top left quarter of the screen is top orthographic. That's what ortho means. That means flat perspective. There's one that's just basic user perspective, which is your standard view. That's in the upper right. The lower right is your right angle perspective. And then the lower left is your front orthographic view. Now what we want to do inside here, these are a couple of things you can also know or may want to know about manipulating these viewports. If you move your mouse over a specific viewport, Blender is sensitive to arranging or moving around your viewport based on where your mouse is located. So if I move my mouse over front orthographic and I use my zoom in and out keys, plus and minus, it only zooms in and out on that window that I currently have my mouse hovering on. But if I move it into top, it starts changing zoom for that particular view instead. So you have to kind of watch where your mouse is located on screen when you're doing certain buttons or shortcuts on Blender, because it won't know what to do if you have your mouse over a panel and you start hitting plus or minus. Then it assumes that you want to mess with a panel instead. All right. But once we got these views out, here's what we want to do with this model. What we want to do is basically get it standing straight up on the base of our cyclorama facing towards us in the front view. And you want to make sure that your model is scaled down enough that it actually fits inside the cyclorama space. So it should be pretty small. So I'm going to select my character. And I'm going to coordinate the rotation of this. You may have to turn off, by the way, temporarily your cyclorama background to see what you're doing. The cyclorama is placed directly on top of the grid plane, so you don't have to worry about where your model appears so long as it looks like it's standing on the grid in your perspective view. But I'm going to come over here to my outline panel and temporarily turn off the eyeball for the cyclorama to make it invisible. And then I'm going to reselect my character. And I'm going to start by rotating the character in one of these viewports, or go into each viewport and rotate it with the R key to try to get it at the right angle of view. And so you want to make sure that as you do that, that you're getting your object to stand in the front view. You want it to stand on the red line. The base of your model should stand on the red line in the front view. In the right view, it should stand on the green line. And also in the right view, you should notice that the model should be in line with the blue line to center it on screen. Same thing with the front perspective or front orthographic. And if you come in your top view, after you've got it standing straight up, you can then hit R in the top view to spin the object around to where it faces us in the front view. And again, you may have to finagle it a couple times in each view to get it set in the right position. But that's what you're using. You're just using the basic R key to move it, click, move on to a different view, make sure that it's standing up and facing us in the front perspective. And then you can turn your cyclorama back on at that time. Make sure the model's scaled to where it fits in the cyclorama. And then we're good for saving our object for next time. And that's pretty much all you do for the first exercise for the project. So I'm going to go ahead and go to File, and we're going to save this thing out. Do it right. So we go to File, Save As. And again, make sure you're saving it to your project folder. I'm putting mine in progress. And again, keep your naming of your Blender file consistent. So put your name on it, the semester, fall 2016, and project 3. You don't need to change any settings in here. That's all you have to do. And then click on the little Save as Blender file up in the upper right. And that's pretty much it. All right. Now that'll conclude for the first demonstration on the project. So make sure that you complete that for exercise 1 of Blender working in the interface.